Hi, in this video I'd like to talk about leverless controllers, and more specifically, the upcoming GLYPH controller from Limit Labs. There are two things I'd like to mention right off the bat. Number one, Limit Labs provided me with this prototype in exchange for an unbiased review, and number two, based on the information publicly available, I made the decision to back the Kickstarter for this controller before they offered to send me this product. In other words, I was already interested enough in this controller to spend my own money. Now that that's out of the way, I'd like to talk about the choices we make in selecting controllers and whether or not those choices are ethical. In 2019, I put forth a methodology through which to analyze rule sets that culminated in the creation of Rishi's Jungle Jam. Watch that video if you haven't seen it already. But to briefly recap some of the key points. A rule set is a set of guidelines that make it so the most reliable ways to win a game is by using the agreed upon valued skills. A common example is the basketball shot clock. Taking the lead and running out the game clock is not a valued skill, so a timer was added to encourage proactive play. Under the same methodology, we've added ledge grab limits and wobbling bands to Melee, and also eliminated stages that contain intrusive random elements. These changes all encourage the use of generally valued skills by the community. The same approach can be applied to controllers. If the community at large were to decide that it is valuable to win by using only first-party Nintendo controllers with zero modifications, then we could certainly make that the rule. But those controllers are subject to all sorts of random variation and varying levels of degradation over time, and so the majority of the community favors quality-of-life modifications such as snapback capacitors. Other modifications followed in due time, including bald buttons, angle notches, trigger plugs, and so forth. Most of these were still not far from the original controller and did not push the envelope far enough to warrant a discussion on defining the valued skills in Smash. The rectangle controller changes things. Snuck into mainstream play under the guise of an ergonomic alternative. By the way, what does ergonomic even mean? The rectangle completely changed the standard for controllers. Now there were players with completely consistent and non-degrading angles, 1.0 dash values, and zero stick travel time simulation. Controllers were forced to keep up through adjustments to UCF and the advent of fobs and goom waves. But the introduction of a new controller was not so disruptive at the time as to force the community to completely reevaluate the standards of what we deem valuable. It would take years before anyone got good enough for these differences in controller to matter. But we are now at that point. I am not necessarily advocating for the ban or legalization of boxes in Melee. I am merely trying to provide the language necessary to have this conversation and to point out that the rate of change in technology far exceeds the speed at which the community is able to organize these conversations. Ultimately, we have to accept that rule sets are arbitrary because valued skills are arbitrary, and we are now at a reckoning in which we need to ask ourselves, what remnants of the OG GameCube controller are still valuable to us, and what are we comfortable giving away? Do we preserve the integrity of analog inputs, or do we allow digital input conversion? Do all directional inputs need to exist on the same Euclidean plane, or can I use a foot pedal to hold down on the C-stick? Keeping rectangle controllers legal is a perfectly valid point to pursue, but we would need to align on exactly what skills related to Smash, including how we physically enact our inputs, are valuable to us as a community. The waters are less hazy when the conversation shifts away from Melee and more towards traditional fighters, which have always used digital inputs even if they are traditionally input through sticks. The conversion from a stick to buttons is much more natural and, in my opinion, superior in the vast majority of cases. Some stick inputs might feel more intuitive than on an all-button controller, but dedicating one finger per directional input spreads out the load and makes inputs feel way easier, at least for me. In cases where you need to input a 360 or 720 degree input, then a stick may feel better, but I think you can learn those inputs easily enough on a leverless. For these reasons, leverless controllers have become increasingly popular over the last several years among traditional fighting game players. There is still some fuzziness on the valued skills in traditional fighters. For example, do we value the muscle required to move the stick all the way left to all the way right, and the amount of time that might pass in between inputs? On a leverless, you simply press the other direction with another finger, and depending on the rule set, you don't even need to time releasing the first input. Inputting left, then right without releasing left is referred to as simultaneous opposing cardinal direction inputs, and can be handled by either overriding the original input or inputting nothing. I personally am a fan of the latter as it more closely emulates a stick input, but there are people far more plugged into that particular discourse than I am, so I would defer to them. In either case, I think leverless controllers are very strong choices for any traditional fighter and are definitely the route that I would personally go. As a career controller Smash player who has only dabbled in traditional fighters, you might be wondering why I decided to invest in the glyph in the first place. What ultimately pushed me over the edge is this. The ethical case for using a leverless in Melee is different than using a leverless in other platform fighters. To make another reference to my Smash Needs a Rule Set overhaul video, Melee tournaments have been deconstructing a rule set for over 20 years, slowly chipping away at something that 99% of people don't fully understand. So when something new is added, its ramifications were not fully discussed until it was too late. This predicament is not the case for other, newer platform fighters that were designed with multiple methods of control in mind. Rivals of Ether, Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl, Multiversus, these games were not, at their inception, designed only for the GameCube controller in the way that Melee was. Keyboard support was built in from the start, and so the discussion as to what skills are valued is completely different. Keep in mind, this is the case even for games that support analog input. You can still argue the merits of holding on to analog input in these games versus the consistency of a digital controller, but the mere inclusion of leverless support at the onset of design changes the basis of the question. It's no longer, do we value these skills? Instead, it's, which controller is best for me? And that brings me to why I purchased the glyph. I already knew I wanted to swap to leverless for traditional fighters. In fact, I was researching Snackbox Micros last summer and probably would have bought one if they weren't sold out after Street Fighter came out. But I have also been curious to try out a leverless controller for platform fighters, and the glyph provides me access to both in one convenient form factor. The glyph is built to support the needs of someone who wants to use a leverless controller for multiple games. I personally like keeping mine in this layout with all buttons accessible so I can easily swap between games, but you can also use one of the other faceplates if you spend most of your time on just one layout. At first, my fingers sometimes got lost amidst the sea of buttons, especially when navigating the Mod X and Mod Y buttons in Smash mode, and I was learning how to play on a box controller for the first time, so it was all a bit confusing, but this is something I was able to overcome pretty quickly as I got more hours on the controller. I think if I were to commit to this longer term, I would try out both the all-button layout as well as the layout swaps. It's honestly pretty easy to swap from one layout to another. Speaking of layouts, one of the commonly addressed issues with this prototype is the difficulty with UI. Every time I use this controller, I have to open the user manual on my computer so I can remember exactly which button to press to swap from hitbox mode to platform fighter mode. Limit Labs has heard this feedback loud and clear and is planning to implement a built-in screen to help simplify this process when the product fully launches. The last thing I want to mention is the look and feel. Looks-wise, I have no complaints. I think it looks great, but obviously this is up to personal preference. You also have the option to load in your own art and buttons if you totally want to change it up. Feel-wise, the buttons are textured PBT compared to the smooth feel of Sanwa buttons or other buttons you'd find on a Frame 1, but again, this comes down to preference, and I personally like them just fine. For Melee, I still plan to stick with the good old-fashioned GameCube controller. It's what I'm most comfortable with, and for me, it's the most valued skill. But I've got my glyph anytime I want to hit the sticks in Street Fighter and Guilty Gear, and who knows, maybe when Multiversus comes back online and Rivals 2 comes out later this year, I'll swap layouts and tap it up. Or I'll stick with the controller and just use the glyph for fun. No matter which path I choose, I know that the most important thing is to conduct myself in accordance with the ethical principles outlined in this video. Because remember, your choice in controller reflects heavily upon your moral character.
Don't mess it up. Be a good person. It's not that hard.
Thanks for watching.